And last but certainly not least, tying up for other innovations on decarbonizing business travel through sustainable aviation fuel, we have Nancy Bsales, the COO of 4Air. Nancy.
Okay, first of all, since Ron cut into my time, I'd like a favor from him, if he can listen for a moment.
You can run over time.
No, that's okay. But Ron, a little favor, since you're, in with the New York State, we would love a SAF incentive. So next time you have a conversation, I think anybody who's working within sustainable aviation fuel would love to see us to start leading, like California. So if you can just put in a good word for us when you're up there. Thank you. So, any chance you have the other presentation?
Yeah,
I'm going to back out.
Well, while they're getting that set, Ron gave a plug for Pat Sackmansley and the Urban Future Lab. Their carbon to value initiative is working on a lot of those things, so we'll make sure to connect to them on that.
We did. I already spoke with them, actually. So, I can actually just start to speak, actually, to a little bit of this. Within aviation, an important thing to understand is that, we're hearing a lot about net zero from corporations, states, and countries, but aviation as a whole has net zero goals in place. And that's really the guidelines of where we need to be today, get tomorrow, and into the future to be net zero by 2050. And I have a true belief that business aviation and aviation as a whole is going to be the first transportation industry to get there, because we have the tools at hand and we have the access to them, because I believe challenges bring innovation, and we're starting to see an innovation within aviation that's just incredible. I think we can really put it up against what we saw in renewable energy in the early 2000s. Renewable energy, you can look at someone like an Apple or a Google, and they were told in the early 2000s that their emissions were too high and they were using too much electricity, and they were the movers and the shakers back then to start to support renewable energy certificates to begin with, and then from after that they were moving towards things like building renewable energy and building wind farms and solar all over the world. Okay, let's get started again. So 4Air, we're a group that works with all stakeholders of aviation from the ground up, actually. Anybody in the supply chain, as well as, manufacturers, operators, airlines, fuel providers, all the way across the chain to figure out how to decarbonize aviation across the industry. A good place to start is, let's look at the 50,000-foot view of what are the emissions within aviation. It's stated that we're 2% of global emissions. We believe it's actually much more than that, because if you start to look at things like upper atmosphere contrails and the additional impacts other than just CO2 alone out of the tailpipe, you start to see that we're closer to about 5%. So what's that come up to? It was about 1 billion metric tons in 2019. It seems like a small amount compared to the 43 billion tons in the world, but it's something that gets a lot of scrutiny, and there's a lot of pressures coming down on aviation, both social pressures, compliance or regulatory pressures, and then corporate pressures. Those three pressures are coming down on the industry to figure out how to decarbonize. 50% of those emissions have been created in the last 20 years, and we expect it to grow by 3 times by 2050. So the question is, how do we decouple emissions from the growth of the industry? Because we want to be a global world, we're going to have to fly there. So it's kind of interesting that, we talk a lot about corporate net zero goals, but actually aviation as an industry was one of the first industries to put goals in place to meet net zero by 2050. The interim goals are carbon neutral growth from 2019, and they used 2019 due to COVID so that they had a baseline to work off of, and to ramp up SAF production to 65% by 2050. That's actually a really large goal, lofty goal. We're at less than 1% today. But they also have strategies in place, and those strategies are technologies, things like new SAF production, new feedstocks, more efficient operations, but that's going to really just change small amounts on, flying more efficiently, landings, air traffic management, and then market-based measures. And to date, those market-based measures were discussions around carbon offsets. And we've heard a lot about carbon offsets over the last couple of days, and they're an important tool within aviation to bridge the gap as we're moving towards more sustainable aviation fuel. But another market-based measure that's actually coming about because of SAF is book and claim. It's a tool being used by those who can't access sustainable aviation fuel to fund and put out a demand signal and use the attributes for reductions. It's an in-sector reduction. This is a great little chart to show you how do we get there. So how do we get from today all the way to 2050, and what areas are going to be taken care of by these innovation. And so we know that when we look at innovation and technology, we're talking about hydrogen and electric aircraft. And the innovation is amazing, but we're not going to see that within the industry for probably 20 years. There's infrastructure that needs to change, and there's a lot of other pieces. Efficiencies are only a small percentage of reduction. Where we're going to see the largest amount of reduction is in SAF. SAF is our near-term solution. But as you can see, what we need to do is use offsets today with that small amount of sustainable aviation fuel, and we need to use it to bridge that gap because we can be carbon neutral today. And then as we move forward and we start to get more feedstocks and more production and more funding coming into sustainable aviation fuel, we're going to grow that, and we're going to use less and less offsets or carbon capture and more SAF. And then what we really see is that the biggest solution is sustainable aviation fuel. And some really great things about SAF is it's a drop-in fuel. What it is the technology is that no infrastructure needs to change. Any aircraft that takes Jet A today can take sustainable aviation fuel. We're only approved to a 50-50 blend. Most SAF is blended at about 30% sustainable aviation fuel with 70% fossil fuels today, but it can be dropped into fuel farms, it can be dropped into pipelines, and it can be dropped into any aircraft wing that is allowed to take Jet A. SAF is Jet A. It is certified to be, it's certified to be used in any aircraft that uses Jet A. So, when we talk about tools and other things we can do, this is a great example of how much SAF is in the world right now. Right now, California really is leading the charge on the volume, but we have to remember that volume is less than 1%. What we're hoping for is about 10% by 2030, and then just grow exponentially from there. So what you can see here is California, because of the low carbon fuel standard and their tax incentives, that's where most of the SAF is going, because we still see a green premium. The green premium over Jet A is about $2 for a gallon, which may not seem like much, but when you start to talk about millions and millions of gallons that the airlines are using, you start to see that it becomes impossible to do. And we're looking for incentives across the country. So Ron, remember, give a good chat when you go upstate today. We've seen incentives now in Chicago, in Illinois, not Chicago, in Illinois, but that's an end user incentive. We're hearing that Minnesota may be coming out. But there's a lot of regulatory and compliance coming down on us at this point. You have ETS in the UK and in the EU and CORSIA, which SAF can actually reduce your obligations against those regulatory programs. So that's an important aspect to look at. Looking at this, we can see that in the New York area, there is no sustainable aviation fuel available. This map only shows places that have continuous flow of SAF. And even when they have that, they probably only have, 10%. San Francisco receives a lot of sustainable aviation fuel, LAX, and this is actually showing smaller airports that you can fly into and uplift SAF. And this is why we're seeing the surgence of book and claim, both for the airlines using it for business travelers. So if you have a business traveler who is interested in flying on sustainable aviation fuel, that maybe offsetting is not the end all for them, they'd like to use a combination and reduce using sustainable aviation fuel, they can work with their airlines and actually they can book and allocate. The airlines, the businesses are helping them pay for their sustainable aviation fuel and increasing that demand signal so we can see more and more production. Or, going airline to airline, or corporate flight departments. I think we're in the New York area. I think there's more corporate flight departments in New York and more private planes flying in and out of this state than any other state in the country, most likely. To meet their net zero goals, they're looking to use sustainable aviation fuel. So where does it come from, and how do you track it? And this is where 4Air really fits in very well. It's about building a framework and building a data structure that is transparent and follows that whole chain of custody, so everyone along the value chain can claim the emission reductions or the fuel for whether it's the blender's tax credit, which is a new tax credit that gives you about $1.50 per gallon that you've created as a blender, down to a corporate flight department or an individual from a corporation, a travel department that wants to reduce their emissions and use that claim against, something like science-based targets. So the chain of custody and the data security around that is where 4Air comes in, monitoring, reporting, and recording sustainable aviation fuel in a transparent manner, in a ledger-type form, so that you can be assured that nobody else is claiming that reduction other than the people who have the rights to it. A really interesting thing is there's only 2 producers right now. World Energy and Neste are the only ones who are producing and putting fuel into the system today. They're using, when you see those commercials that says the French fry you ate today is the fuel of tomorrow, it is true. That is what's being done. But we're starting to see more and more feedstocks and more complication, I'm going to say. We've recorded and tracked over 1,500 uplifts, and what you see is a different blend on every batch. Right now, we're only seeing really 2 feedstocks, but that will turn into 10, 20, 30. There are more than 200 producers who are looking to make sustainable aviation fuel. And as of today, we're only seeing those 2 feedstocks, but we're going to start to see more municipal solid waste. We're going to see woody biomass and agricultural biomass being used in the next phase. And then, really amazing is, basically power to liquid fuels and synthetics are probably the future of aviation fuel. So I'm sure people probably have questions, but, how 4Air fits into this is actually kind of creating this pathway for any aviation stakeholders we work with manufacturers to operators on the ground and in the air to help them on their journey to get to 2050 and to help the people who are flying every day feel better about climbing on that aircraft and continuing to enjoy the world around us. That's it.
Questions?
Oh, no.
Great, thank you very much. That was excellent. As possibly the only commercial pilot in the room, I have a question for you.
Sure.
If you dig into the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a grant in there or a benefit credit in there for alternative fuels up to $1.75 a gallon for sustainable aviation fuel. It may not be clear exactly who gets that and things like that,
Sure.
but you were saying the difference was $2 today. So that sounds pretty close. I'm just curious if that's being used already, who's using it, and if you think that's
Sure.
going to have a big impact. Thank you.
So I think one thing to understand, first of all, the $2 difference, the $2 green premium is on a blended gallon. So that's only 30% a neat gallon. That $1.75 is going to be on a neat gallon. And the blender's tax credit goes to the blender. So since fuel has to be blended with traditional fossil, at that point, that is the person who's going to receive that $1.75 credit. And that credit is actually obviously not going to be seen until next year, right? So anything they're producing this year, they'll see that credit next year. We are questioning whether we will actually see that as an end consumer as a price differential. We really don't envision that. What we do need is more incentives universally, we need more incentives, because until that price parity comes closer and closer together, we're not going to see large usage of sustainable aviation fuel or policy. Honestly, it's one or the other.
Right here next, and then.
Hello. Quick question about using clean hydrogen as aviation fuel. Our company already have a couple pilots that go produce clean hydrogen, and I've seen a lot of presentations that it's going to go in the actual aviation fuel.
So I mean, that's moving in towards those synthetics and those, CO2 capture and hydrogen. And I do see that coming down the pipeline, but we do need a lot more funding coming to it. Any fuel producers who are trying to go from concept to fruition, they go out, they get those MOUs in place, and then they need capital, right? You can't get over the finish line unless we get capital. And I think that's the most important thing for us all to realize in this room, is that more money has to go towards sustainable aviation fuel to get it from where it is to where we need it to be. Hydrogen is also being looked at as an alternative propulsion. We work very closely with Cambridge University, and they're doing a lot of work in the Aviation Accelerator Impactor that talks about using hydrogen as a alternative fuel completely. But we don't expect to see that till 2050, and some interesting little things around it is infrastructure, right? So whether electric or hydrogen, if you're using it to create SAF, that's one thing. But if you're actually using it to power the aircraft, infrastructure is another piece that will need a lot of funding to come into it.
Thank you. Hi. How important is private aviation to your business, and what do you think is the impact of the inevitable pressure on private aviation that is clearly growing in terms of driving demand for SAF as a kind of triage to allow it to
Right.
continue?
So interesting is in 2019 and 2020, I think private aviation used 50% of the sustainable aviation fuel in the system. It was a time that obviously airlines were struggling a bit, and I always say we're influencing the influencers, right? So the people in the back of the plane, whether they have the corporate pressures, they also have the funding to put towards it, and they have they want it. Honestly, they truly want it. It's a smaller portion of a larger volume. They only use probably about, I think it's 18 billion gallons a year. Their emissions are about 18 million metric tons in total, but the social pressures, probably more than anything. I've been at a couple of conferences around business aviation, and there's been protesters at every one of them. So the social pressures definitely will come down on them, that they will be the first movers, honestly. I think they will be the first movers on full usage. If you could bring in SAF into New York, I could find you a number of flight departments who would be the first to fill up their fuel farms.
So thank you for a great presentation. I'm really glad you're doing this work. We did speak yesterday. I run the Urban Future Lab, and I want the audience to know that we have a company in New York that is making a ton of SAF a day. That's not very much. They're called the Air Company. They're taking CO2, running it through an electrolyzer with water, turning it into hydrogen, adding a catalyst, making alcohols, and some of those alcohols are vodka, some are high-value perfume, and the third stream is sustainable aviation fuel, which they want to have as their business model going forward. They've already raised $40 million. They're raising $100 million now. They've been third-party verified by NASA. The Air Force flew a test flight with 100% Air Company fuel, and therefore the Air Force has invested in them, Virgin Air has invested in them, JetBlue has invested in them, and the Department of Defense just gave them $65 million in funding to build a plant on one of their sites. So this is real. It's third-party verified. If any of you in the audience are investors and you want to talk about their upcoming round, I'm happy to introduce you. And I'm a not-for-profit. I don't benefit from this, just helping the world.
No,
Thank you.
that's what we like to hear. It's amazing how many innovators, but one thing we'll talk about is that the reporting and the documenting of this is going to become more and more complicated. And that's really where we've been fitting in with corporate flight departments as well, is they really need that transparent reporting behind the sustainable aviation fuel, because you're going from, different feedstocks, different blends, different reductions based on the feedstock you're using. and how can they report that in the end? So that's also an important thing that we will all need to consider as we're moving forward with sustainable aviation fuel. No, I just say SAF is Jet A. Every time, I work with any of the industry, you have to say SAF is Jet A, so that you understand that sustainable aviation fuel can be used, is a drop-in fuel and can be used in any aircraft that uses Jet A. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.